I'm going to cover chapter 5, sections 5.5 and 5.6. These really focus on the coconut, on the brain a little bit. It's our first kind of take on the brain, and it's part in identity and certainty. Section 5.5, the uncertainty organ. The brain escapes the instant. It is the organ and origin of uncertainty. If you think about it, we're only uncertain because of our brain. Our stomach doesn't make us uncertain. If it wasn't for the brain, we wouldn't be uncertain about anything. So it's a little chauvinistic to think about the universe just in the context of our brain, because it's got a lot of limitations. Just like the limitations on what we can see, our visual bandwidth and hearing, the brain can only think so much and can only think within a very, very narrow scope. So definitely the definition of universal laws could easily be well beyond the capacity of our gray matter. Abstracting is an imaginary non-instant state that we refer to as past and future, made up of thin traces of images, sounds, emotions, and the words we use to conveniently organize our brain traces. I'm not calling them memories because computers have co-opted the term memory as a nearly perfect bit per bit digital reconstruction of reality. Yeah, so computers really have much more accurate memory than we do, of course. No, my brain lacks such accuracy. Try recalling today's breakfast accurately. What did it taste like, look like? At best, my recall is a thin trace. Curiously, even if an action is habituated, i.e. repeated over and over again until it becomes a habit, I find it difficult to recount it accurately, point for point, without any careful study of the process and writing it down ad nauseum. If I try to consider a detailed chronology of my typical morning routine, for example, I may find it quite difficult. The brain seeks novelty, doing its duty by processing new data and focusing on the fresh stuff. The only way to keep the brain gratified is by fresh action taken when it signals it's being confronted with pattern incongruity, something that doesn't fit its multitude of cognitive templates built up over the years. It signals me to wash my hands when my hands are in a state that is incongruent with its benchmarks for cleanliness. I barely need to think about it. We further abstract these traces by labeling them with words, fundamentally sounds and symbols that represent the traces, so we can capture some record of them. I might brand a Clapton concert as moving or spectacular, but the words are themselves defined by other words, abstractions of abstractions, and fail to adequately capture the sensation when hearing the first 7 notes of Layla, for example, Clapton and Gordon, 1971. Without caution, so much brain abstraction distances my attention from authentic experience of the instant. A group dancing enthusiastically at a concert has an intense shared manifesting experience in the instant that is barely shareable later. King's "I Have a Dream" and Kennedy's "Don't Ask What Your Country Can Do for You" speeches have echoed powerfully through the decades, inspiring many. But if you would ask someone who was in attendance what it was like hearing it, they might be rendered speechless. It's impossible to find the words that convey the instantaneous sensation of an epiphany. But without the words, there is no communication of such traces, or others, or even reinforcement within the confines of my own brain. All sense of past and future is simply a brain-based trace plus the cognitive abstractions it creates, digesting each trace through the language and conceptualization. Quite insubstantial compared with reality, and only gaining permanence after my brain creates an emotional validation. 5.6, brain data domain. The brain synthesizes certainty with emotion. It combines the traces of meaning with present sensory input while adding a dash of emotion to make it sticky, and voila, new memories, synthesis. Without emotion, there's no recall. Experiences lacking novelty skip emotional labeling, becoming habituated. pigeonholed after regular exposure, causing them to disappear into the background. Consider the daily commute or toothbrushing. Like the vivid foreground in the aerial perspective of a misty day, only traces with an emotional link are easily accessible. Emotion is effectively the brain's file labeling system. If the brain doesn't emotionally label an event, it disappears. Not completely, but materially. Conversely, a highly emotional event can be indelible and remembered almost verbatim, even inescapable, regardless of my will to erase it. As I age, the emotionality of external experience wanes, as many common events are relegated to habituation. The novelty numbs. The emotion-laden traces from the past, however, remain imprinted even photographically. Consider the sensation when I consider the phrase, my mother. It provokes an instantaneous emotional experience combined with images and some associated words, abstractions of those experiences. Speaking the phrase, my mother, is merely a symbolic representation, a sound made by vocal cords to represent a trace, but this familiar sound is overladen with powerful emotions. Why do I reflexively recall my personal story of my mother tending to a bee sting on my foot when I was 3 years old, rather than the purely logical response that the symbol mother, or the symbolic sound mother, means one that gives birth to offspring? Why the conflation? Why the persistent algorithm of fitting reality into preconceived stories? Because a story is an abstraction of a trace of reality wrapped in emotion, and emotions create motive. Emotions are my root motivation to act. Call it emotivation. Though the brain appears to be my only domain of perception, it is not. Eyesight is limited to the individual's visible bandwidth of electromagnetic radiation, a function of the physics of the eye. But EMR goes infinitely beyond the visual range of humans. Hearing is limited to an individual's auditory range of frequencies, a function of ear mechanics. But sound frequencies range far beyond the human auditory spectrum. A CPU, central processing unit, set up for iOS, for example, cannot effectively process Windows set up for DOS, and vice versa. Likewise, I am limited to the scope of my experience by my cognitive bandwidth, both intellectually, IQ, and systemically, my cognitive binary coding. Let's call bandwidth plus IQ, B plus IQ, the total human capacity for brain-based experience. This is to say that 1, the brain is limited to a binary logic system, and 2, just as each person has different visual acuity, each incidence of this brain system, i.e. my brain, is further constrained by my comprehensive intelligence capacity. Since my brain, it would appear, is the only conduit through which all my experience flows, my experience of reality is constrained accordingly by my B plus IQ. Presumably, all of my experience of reality are bottlenecked and filtered by my B plus IQ. In this context, I am a fish in the water of my B plus IQ. So knowing nothing but water, I have no context for air. All experience comes to me through my unique B plus IQ. If there is a reality beyond, how would I experience it? Here's where the fish has an advantage, because fish have minimal identity, but I am human with a big brain enough to seek self-justification. Adding it up, the potential limitations of human experience of reality can become manifold unless I can control identity seeking. I am conditioned to know the instant of reality narrowly through my B plus IQ, which is further distorted as it passes through the lens of the identity game. Whether or not I have awareness that I am in the game is key. Flying fish know that there are experiences beyond the water. Their forefathers liked it so much they kept jumping out until they evolved wings, enabling them to spend more time in the air. Likewise with me, once I recognize that my identity is a small game being played within a much larger, interesting domain, I will keep leaping beyond my identity. Quote, in every way, then, such prisoners would recognize as reality nothing but the shadows of those artificial objects. How could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? Unquote. This is from In the Republic. There's a piece called The Allegory of the Cave. It's really powerful, and you need to read it a few times to really get it. But when you get it big. It's very impactful, and it really talks about the fact how most people are fish in water. They don't know there's air. Consider a domain of slightly larger scope than my identity-based brain alone can conjure. What would it be like? Perhaps it has a horizon of possibility that is somewhat greater than my conventional identity will even allow. Perhaps my brain is just a tool, a logistical device for solving problems and reasoning out next steps. Important, but no longer the puppet master, constantly spinning its narrative and pressing me to perform within that narrative. In this domain, I free my thoughts from the constant anchor of identity reinforcement. Like the flying fish, I am freed to evolve to this new horizon of possibilities. Failures and other impediments are diminished because I no longer seek identity meaning in them. That's an important sentence. Failures and impediments are no longer meaningful because I'm not seeking meaning in those. I'm not seeking to be amplified by them or diminished by them, but that's a type of amplification in the case of identity. Like a first visit to Disneyland, this fantastic new domain relieves me of the compulsion to find identity in the experience. I am liberated from my identity, allowing my childlike imagination to take over. As my old identity shrinks in the rearview mirror, I am free to gaze alertly forward at what adventure is coming next. As I do, my reliance on anchoring my experience to my identity dissolves in favor of simply discovering and responding to the larger world manifesting before my eyes. Likewise, the distance, difficulties, and disorders along the path are seen for what they really are, merely set pieces in a much larger game of limitless possibility. What is the scope of achievement available to me in this new domain? How grand could this new horizon become? What are the new destinies I can play at manifesting? It turns out that the specific answers to these questions are, at the same time, both simple to see and hard to implement. Simple because, set free of my identity, my horizon of possibilities begins to expand and clarify. Hard because I must choose a course of action and stick to it without attaching identity to any particular outcome that comes along the way, while using the real data from those outcomes as my compass forward. I must connect the dots.